The first morning I woke up in the Philippines, I lay there for a few seconds completely still, waiting for my alarm to go off. It didn't, of course. There was no alarm. There hadn't been one set in weeks. But my body didn't know that yet. For 34 years working at a paper mill outside of Sudbury, my body had been trained to wake up already bracing for something. And old habits don't disappear just because you bought a one-way ticket to the other side of the world. Instead of an alarm, I heard roosters. And then a dog somewhere. And then what sounded like a broom sweeping concrete outside, that slow rhythmic scraping sound that I'd come to learn meant 6 in the morning in this country as reliably as any clock. I lay there listening, and after a few seconds I remembered where I was, and the strangest feeling came over me. Not excitement. Not peace either, not yet. Just this quiet, strange unfamiliarity, like my whole life had been rearranged overnight and I was only now starting to notice. I hadn't moved to the Philippines looking for paradise. I want to be honest about that right from the start, because I've watched enough YouTube videos about expat life to know how these stories usually get told. The beaches, the low cost of living, the friendly locals. And look, all of that is real. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But that's not why I came. The real reason is harder to explain. And it took me a long time to even find the right words for it. I came because I was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. I spent most of my adult life in Northern Ontario. Born there, raised there, married there, retired there. My wife Sandra passed away 4 years before I left, and that changed everything in ways I'm still understanding. We'd been together 31 years. She was the kind of person who made a house feel like a home just by being in it. And after she was gone, that same house started feeling like something else entirely. Not a bad place. Just empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. My son Brian lived 2 hours away in Barrie with his wife and their kids. My daughter Joanne was in Vancouver, which might as well have been another country some winters. I had friends, mostly guys I'd worked with at the mill, and we'd get together for hockey games or the occasional fishing trip, and those were good times, I mean that. But somewhere in my early 60s, I started noticing that most of our conversations were about things that had already happened. The old days at the mill, people we used to know, summers that felt longer when we were younger. We were all living inside our own memories a little more than we were living inside our actual lives. I don't think I was depressed. I want to be careful about how I say this, because depression is a real thing, and I've seen it up close, and what I had wasn't that. I still laughed. I still drove up to Brian's place for the kids' birthdays. I still watched the Leafs lose in the playoffs every year, like some kind of spiritual practice. But underneath all of it, there was this low-grade heaviness that I couldn't seem to shake. Like life had turned into something I was managing, rather than something I was actually part of. I remember one particular night in February, maybe 3 years after Sandra died. I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea that had gone cold because I'd forgotten to drink it, watching snow come down outside the window, and I realized I couldn't remember what I'd done that day. Not a single specific thing. I'd gotten up, eaten something, watched television, gone to bed, and the day had just dissolved. And the frightening part wasn't that one day had been like that. The frightening part was that I couldn't remember the last day that hadn't been like that. The Philippines entered my head the way most things do when you're a retired widower with too much quiet time. Through YouTube at 11 o'clock at night. I started watching videos of people living abroad, mostly out of boredom, the way you end up watching documentaries about places you'll never go. But something about the Philippines specifically kept pulling my attention back. It wasn't the beaches, though those are obviously beautiful. What caught me was something harder to define. People in those videos looked unhurried. Not lazy, there's a difference. Just unhurried. Neighbors sitting outside talking in the evenings. Old men playing chess in plastic chairs. Kids running around in narrow streets while somebody cooked something nearby that smelled good enough to come through the screen. Nobody looked like they were racing anywhere. Nobody looked like they were performing for anyone. Life was just happening, slowly, out in the open, and people seemed to be actually inside it rather than rushing past it. I told myself it was just the camera making things look nicer than they were. You know how that works. Everybody's life looks manageable from the outside. But I kept watching, and the more I watched, the more I noticed that it wasn't the spectacular things that held my attention. It was the ordinary things. The Tahoe vendor going down a side street early in the morning. An old woman hanging laundry while she talked to her neighbor over a fence. A group of men fixing a motorbike together in the shade of a mango tree. No apparent hurry, somebody periodically handing someone else a tool. I watched those videos for almost 2 years before I ever seriously thought about going. The thing that finally moved me wasn't any one video or any one moment. It was a Tuesday in January, -27 with the wind chill, and I was trying to get my truck started in the driveway and it wouldn't turn over. And I stood there in the dark at 7 in the morning with my breath-making clouds in front of my face, thinking, I have done this exact thing probably 500 times in my life, and I am going to do it 500 more times if I stay here. And for the first time that thought didn't feel like just weather. It felt like a choice. I didn't tell anyone for months. Not Brian, not Joanne, not my friend Reg, who I'd known since we were 19 years old working summers at the same hardware store. I'd go to the Wednesday night card game and sit across from guys I'd known for decades, and somewhere in the back of my head I'd be reading Reddit threads about visa requirements in the Philippines. It sounds strange now. At the time it just felt private, like something I needed to figure out for myself before I could explain it to anyone else. I finally told Reg over beers at his place one night watching a game. He stared at me for a long moment, and then he said, "The Philippines." He said it the way you'd say the moon, like it was a place that technically existed but had no practical relevance to anyone's actual life. I tried to explain it, and the words came out all wrong. I said something about pace, and something about community, and something about just needing to feel different before I got too old to feel different. He nodded slowly, in the way people nod when they're being polite. A few weeks later he mentioned it again and told me he thought it was grief talking. Maybe he was right. I've thought about that a lot since. Joanne cried when I told her. Not in a bad way, exactly, but the kind of crying that tells you someone is scared. She asked about my health insurance. She asked about what would happen if I got sick. She asked whether I'd thought about the heat. I had thought about all of those things, but when I tried to explain that I'd done research, that I had enough money from Sandra's life insurance and my pension and the sale of the house to be comfortable, that people did this all the time and it wasn't as dangerous as it sounded, she got very quiet in the way Joanne gets quiet when she's deciding whether to argue or just worry privately. She chose to worry privately, which is very much her way. Brian was quieter about it. He said he just wanted me to be happy. He said it simply, and I believed him, and that meant more to me than almost anything else in those months of preparation. I sold the house in late September. That was harder than I expected. 31 years of a life in that house, most of it good. Sandra's garden out back. The deck we built together the summer Brian was born. The wood all weathered now and soft in places, but still standing. Standing in the empty kitchen on the last day with the keys in my hand, I felt something I couldn't quite name. Not regret. More like I was closing a door behind me that I knew wouldn't open again. And I was trying to make sure I meant to close it. 3 weeks later I was on a plane. The first thing that hit me when I walked out of the airport in Cebu was the heat. I knew it was going to be hot. I'd read about it, watched videos about it, had it described to me by every person who'd ever spent time in Southeast Asia. None of that prepared me. The air in Canada in October, even on a warm day, has a crispness to it, a definition. This air had no edges at all. It was like walking into a room that the whole atmosphere was in, a weight you carried with you that had no intention of lifting. My glasses fogged up immediately. My shirt was damp before I even found the taxi line. The noise was the second thing. I'm from Sudbury, I'm not a delicate man, but the Philippines is loud in a specific and relentless way. Motorbikes, horns, dogs, roosters at completely unreasonable hours. Music from what sounded like 3 different directions. Somebody doing construction work seemingly at every hour of the day, including hours when construction work has no business happening. My first night in the guest house, I barely slept. I lay there on top of the covers because it was too warm for blankets and listened to the street outside and thought, well, you've done it now. I almost called Brian the next morning. I almost said the word mistake out loud into my phone. Instead, I went out and found somewhere to eat breakfast because I hadn't eaten properly since the airport in Toronto, and my body was confused about what time it was, and I figured food was at least one problem I could solve immediately. The restaurant was a small place on a side street, plastic chairs, a handwritten menu on a chalkboard, an electric fan making a sound like it was personally exhausted by the job. A woman about my age came out from the back and smiled and handed me the menu, and I stared at it blankly because I recognized almost nothing on it. She noticed me staring, and without any sign of impatience, she pulled a chair up beside me and started going through it, pointing at things and describing them in careful, accented English. "This one is sweet," she said. "This one a little sour. This one you eat with rice, very filling." She had all the time in the world, or at least she moved like she did. I ate sinangag and eggs, and some kind of dried fish that I wasn't sure about, but ended up being good. Sitting there with the fan blowing warm air at me, while the neighborhood gradually came alive outside. A man walked past with a cart selling something I couldn't identify. 2 schoolgirls in uniforms went by talking seriously to each other about something that seemed very important. A dog appeared and sat down near my table and looked at me with enormous dignity, and I looked back at it, and we reached some kind of understanding. I walked back to the guest house, thinking that I hadn't rushed through that breakfast. I'd just sat there and eaten it slowly and watched the street, and nobody had made me feel like I was taking up space that could be used by someone else. That was a small thing. But it was the first small thing, and in the weeks that followed there were more small things. And eventually, small things are what change you. The neighborhood I eventually settled in, a few weeks after arriving, was in Dumaguete, on Negros Oriental. I'd read about it online, the city of gentle people they call it, which sounds like a tagline, but turns out to be surprisingly accurate in my experience. It's a university town, quieter than Cebu, a boulevard along the water, with palm trees and people sitting on benches in the evenings. The pace there suited me in a way I hadn't quite dared to hope for. Within a week of moving into my apartment, people knew my name. Not because I introduced myself to everyone. I'm not actually a very forward person, despite what this video might suggest. But the woman who ran the little store at the end of the block asked me one morning where I was from, and I told her, and she told me her brother had worked on a fishing boat that went to British Columbia once, and after that, she asked me every morning how I'd slept and whether I'd eaten. The security guard at the building nodded to me by the 3rd day. The man who sold fruit from a cart on the corner started holding back the mangoes he knew I liked. I had lived in the same house in Sudbury for 31 years. I knew my neighbors by sight. I did not know most of their names. That is not a criticism of Sudbury. It's just a description of a way of living that I had come to accept as normal. And the Philippines made me realize that it wasn't the only way. The loneliness still found me, though. I want to be honest about that, because it's the part that gets left out of most expat stories. You can move to the other side of the world and still take yourself with you. I still had quiet evenings that went on too long. I still reached for my phone sometimes to text Sandra something I'd seen, and then remembered, and the remembering was still hard even years later. Maybe harder in a new place, because grief has nowhere familiar to attach itself to. The first Christmas there was the worst. I talked to Brian and his family over video on Christmas Eve, watching his kids open presents in the background, my grandchildren tearing into wrapping paper, with that beautiful total commitment that children bring to everything. I could hear his wife Angela in the kitchen. I could see the lights on their tree. And when the call ended, I sat in my apartment, in 30-degree heat in December, and I felt very far away from everything I'd ever belonged to. I went for a walk because I couldn't just sit there. The street outside was full of people. Every house seemed to have its doors open, and its lights on and music coming from inside, and the smell of food was everywhere. And children were running around with those parole lanterns, the star-shaped Christmas lanterns they make here, pink and yellow and blue against the dark. I walked for a while feeling like a ghost, moving through someone else's celebration. Then I heard my name. My neighbor Ferdinand was standing at his gate with his wife Carla, and their youngest daughter, who was maybe 8 or 9 and very serious about everything in the way some children are. Ferdinand was in his early 50s, had worked for years in the Middle East on contract before coming home to retire early, and we talked a few times about what that adjustment had been like. He waved me over and asked why I was walking alone on Christmas, and I said something about not wanting to impose, and he looked genuinely baffled by this idea. Impose on what? He said. There was no other possibility in his mind except that I come inside. What happened that evening I have thought about many times since. It wasn't fancy. A small house, relatives arriving in waves throughout the night, children everywhere, a table covered in food that I mostly couldn't name but ate anyway, because everything smelled wonderful. Ferdinand's mother was there, maybe 80 years old, tiny and quick-eyed, who took it upon herself to feed me personally throughout the evening, appearing at my elbow with something new every time I seemed to have finished something. Carla's sisters asked me questions about Canada with enormous curiosity. Not the polite small-talk questions, but real ones. Does it really snow that much? Do you actually eat poutine? Is it true the healthcare is free? At some point someone produced a video machine, which for those who don't know, is essentially karaoke but louder, and I was handed a microphone and given no real option but to sing something, so I sang an old Gordon Lightfoot song, and apparently this was a significant hit, because Ferdinand immediately made me do another one. I went back to my apartment that night, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, not just happy, included. There's a difference that I'm not sure I can fully explain, but when you've spent a few years feeling like you're standing slightly outside of life, looking in, that feeling of being pulled into someone else's living room and treated like you belong there does something to a part of you that had quietly given up on belonging anywhere. I called Joanne the next morning and she could hear it in my voice. She said, "You sound different." I said, "I think I might be okay." The months that followed changed me gradually, the way weather changes a landscape. I stopped rushing everywhere. This sounds obvious. There was nowhere in particular to rush to. I was retired. I had nowhere to be. But even without a schedule, I'd still been moving through my days in that brisk Northern Ontario way, efficiently, purposefully, always with a sense that idling was something you earned rather than something you just did. I'd feel guilty sitting on my balcony for an hour with a coffee watching the street below. I'd feel like I was wasting something. That feeling faded. Not overnight, and not completely, but enough that I started having afternoons where I'd sit outside and just watch things happen. The vendor going by, the kids playing basketball on the court down the road, the light changing on the water at the end of the boulevard, and it would feel like enough. More than enough. It would feel, in some way, I'm still trying to understand, like the actual point. There were hard parts, too. And I think it matters to say this clearly, because the internet has a way of turning everything into either horror or paradise, and real life is neither. The heat wore me down more than I expected, especially in March and April when the air barely moves. I had a bad bout of stomach trouble in my 3rd month that kept me in the apartment for 4 days, and left me genuinely wondering if I was being foolish for the first time since arriving. The bureaucracy around visa extensions is a whole separate ordeal that I won't get into detail about, except to say that the words monthly reporting will haunt me until I'm in the ground. And I missed people. I missed Brian's kids, missed watching them grow up in real time rather than through a screen. I missed Reg and the Wednesday card games. I missed real Canadian winter sometimes, which sounds insane given why I left, but there's something about snow that I apparently have some deep ancestral attachment to that I can't fully explain. I missed Tim Hortons on a cold morning in a way that I can only describe as visceral. These aren't small things. I want to be honest that you give things up. But here is what I had not expected to find. 8 months after arriving, I flew back to Toronto for 3 weeks. Brian's son had a hockey tournament, and I wanted to be there, and I also wanted to check in on a few things, some banking matters, a couple of medical appointments that were easier to handle in Canada. I'd been looking forward to it. The familiar streets, the familiar food, the familiar everything. What I found instead was that Canada felt slightly wrong in a way I couldn't locate precisely. The airports were tense, in a way I'd stopped noticing. When I lived there, everybody moving fast with their headphones in, faces tight. The particular exhaustion of people who have somewhere to be and resent needing to get there. I stood in a Loblaws on the second day and stared at the cereal aisle for probably 2 full minutes. I couldn't explain why. There were just so many choices, all of them shouting at me from the shelf, and I'd been living for 8 months in a country where you bought what was available, and it was generally fine. And something about all those choices felt like too much of something, rather than the right amount of anything. I had a good time. I want to be clear about that. Brian's son's team won their semifinal, and I watched it from the stands in a cold arena, eating an overpriced hot dog, and it was genuinely one of the better evenings I'd had in years. Angela made a big dinner the night before I flew back. We sat around the table until late, and I looked at my grandchildren and felt grateful in a way that probably showed on my face. But when the plane landed back in Cebu and I came out of the terminal into that wall of humid air, the thing that happened surprised me. I relaxed. My shoulders dropped. My jaw unclenched. The driver waiting for me outside said, "Welcome back, sir," and I thought, yeah, back, that's the right word. I have been here nearly 2 years now. My life would look quiet to most people from the outside, and I suppose it is. I wake up when the roosters decide the world needs announcing, usually around 5, and I make coffee and sit on my balcony and watch the neighborhood come awake below me. I walk down to get a proper breakfast most mornings, usually at a little place about 10 minutes from the apartment, where the woman who runs it knows I like it with extra vinegar, and now just brings it that way without asking. I write a bit, work on some things remotely that bring in a small amount of income. Go to the market, talk to people. Ferdinand and I have gotten into the habit of sitting outside some evenings with something cold to drink, while the neighborhood does what it does around us. It is not a dramatic life, but it is mine in a way that my life in Sudbury, by the end, had stopped feeling like. I think about Sandra often here, more peacefully than I did in that house, where everything reminded me of what was missing. I think she would have found this place overwhelming at first and fallen in love with it eventually, in that order, because that was how she approached most things. I think she would have been charmed by Carla's mother and her mission to feed me. I think she would have found the roosters intolerable, which is the right position to take. When I talk to Joanne now, she says I sound like myself. I didn't realize I'd stopped sounding like myself until she said that, and when she did, I had to take a moment before I could answer her, because I understood what she meant exactly, and I didn't know quite what to do with the feeling it brought up. I got a question the other week from someone watching this channel. He's a retired teacher from outside of London, Ontario, and he wanted to know whether he'd be making a mistake if he came here, whether the loneliness would be too much, whether a man his age could really start over somewhere new. He said his kids were worried and his friends thought he was having some kind of crisis. I thought about his question for a long time before I replied, because I didn't want to give him a brochure. I didn't want to tell him it would be easy. because it wouldn't be, not at first. I didn't want to oversell the thing that had worked for me as a solution for everyone, because it isn't. Some people come here and they hate it, and they go home, and there's nothing wrong with that. The heat alone would be a deal breaker for a lot of people I know. What I finally told him was this: the question worth asking isn't whether you'll be comfortable. You probably won't be, at first. The question is whether the life you're living now is actually living, or whether it's something else. Whether you're inside your own days, or just getting through them. Because if it's the second thing, if you recognize that low-grade heaviness I was describing earlier, the one that isn't depression but isn't aliveness either, then geography might not fix it, but it can shake something loose. It can force you into situations where you can't rely on your old habits and your old routines to protect you from yourself. And sometimes that's what you need, not comfort. Disruption, the kind that asks you who you actually are when everything familiar is gone. I don't know if I'll stay here forever. I'm 63 years old, and I'm healthy, all things considered, but I have to be honest with myself that health doesn't stay the same, and there may come a time when being closer to Canadian healthcare makes more sense than being here. I think about that. Joanne thinks about it enough for both of us, bless her. But right now, on a Tuesday morning with coffee going cold beside me, and the sound of someone sweeping the sidewalk below my balcony, and a rooster somewhere making his deeply unnecessary contribution to the day, I feel present in my own life in a way that I didn't think was available to me anymore. That's really it. That's the whole thing. Not paradise, not an escape, just the feeling of being actually here, in my own days, noticing them while they're happening. That feeling turns out to be enough, more than enough. It might be, I've come to think, almost everything.